If you're just joining us today, either here in person or online, again, it's good to have you and hope you feel welcome. Hope you feel like you walk away with something beneficial to you and maybe a friendship or two, starting as well. We have been working through 1 Corinthians, which is one of the Apostle Paul's letters to a church in ancient Corinth in the New Testament over the last, multiple weeks now. I think this is week 14, so we're about halfway in or something like that at this point in time. Week 12, I'm sorry. And so we've been learning about life from their perspective, and it has this main theme of honor versus humility, because there were a lot of things in ancient Corinth that were just pushing people toward whatever they could do in society to collect more honor and prestige in the eyes of people, and culturally that meant a lot of different things. And Paul is saying, I think instead of looking to your culture for so much direction, you need to look at Jesus, specifically Jesus on the cross, and see how his personality and his character, especially on the cross, is a contrast to so many things that your society is pushing right now. And maybe take a lesson from the humility of Jesus. And so he's challenging their culture, but I think that's a valuable lesson for us as well, because we're not so humble as Americans in 2024 sometimes either. And so maybe we can learn a few things from the Apostle Paul in the process as he's giving guidance to this church in ancient Corinth. And just to give you a little bit of review, some followers of Jesus in ancient Corinth, they think they're free to do anything that's socially acceptable. So if society writes off on it, if the majority of people around them think it's fine, then that's probably okay for them as a follower of Jesus to do as well. And then there are other people in ancient Corinth that are just trying to satisfy their bodies. They're looking to their body for that ultimate guidance. So whatever they feel like they need to do, that's what they're doing, just seeking physical satisfaction. Even last week, as we discovered, visiting prostitutes. So they're taking it a little bit too far, perhaps in several ways. But Paul is encouraging them, I think you need to put some boundaries on the things that you're doing with your bodies by asking if those things you're doing are actually separating relationships or controlling your own will or willpower, or driven just by your selfish cravings and not something that's really going to benefit other people. He also reminds them that as a follower of Jesus, Jesus paid a high price to have a relationship with them, for the right to incorporate them into his body, his community. And so shouldn't they be using their bodies for things that Jesus would want to advance in the world? So he brought those things to them last week. But for other followers of Jesus in ancient Corinth, the pendulum has swung the opposite direction, almost, too far. Instead of openly embracing anything that their bodies desire, they're completely avoiding maybe some good things, even intimacy, even in their marriages, because they think that they need to push it completely in the opposite direction. And that the most spiritual thing to do is to almost deny the fact that they're even living in a body. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Our topic for this morning is marriage misunderstandings. Now, this is like Pandora's box. We could talk for ages on this. So this is going to be really focused on what Paul's talking about. If we want to have personal conversations in the living room with our friends or over a meal about marriage misunderstandings, I'm sure we could tell stories and, like I said, talk for a long, long time, because I as well am in a marriage, and communication is challenging when you have very different people on very different pages with very different upbringings. Obviously, there's a lot of room for misunderstandings, so we have our fair share of them all the time, as well as I'm sure some of you who are in marriages as well do. But we're going to stick to what Paul's discussing this morning in this particular passage. And we're going to get an eye into the average day in the life of a Corinthian and some of the things that they're wrestling with in their marriages, specifically as followers of Jesus. And I just want to tell you up front, it's going to sound kind of strange. Their cultural perspectives are very different than ours, but we're going to learn a few things about their culture, and then we're going to try to apply it in our own culture as we wrap things up today as well. So I want to begin this way. We're going to look at some misinformation. What are the Corinthian followers of Jesus thinking versus where Paul thinks Jesus actually wants them to go? And he says this to start out chapter 7, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1. He says, "Now concerning the things about which you wrote." So they have written him previously. He's actually written them previously as well. And he mentions that in the book. And we don't have that correspondence. So we kind of have to put the puzzle pieces together, try to figure out what Paul's talking about to the best of our ability here. So just so you know, this is the best of my ability. This may not be, absolute hard fact that you could, win a court case over. This is my best ability to try to figure out what's going on, and that of many other Bible scholars as well. A lot of scholars actually believe this next phrase, "it is good for a man not to touch a woman," is not something that Paul was telling the Corinthians. It is something that they had written in their previous correspondence with him, because he's saying, now concerning the thing which you wrote, here's this thing. And everything Paul's going to say from this point on is going to contradict that statement. So that's also a good, valid reason, I think, to believe that this is probably something they believed as a culture. And they're not talking about just walking up and touching a woman on the shoulder. The context of this is sexual intimacy. So it's their polite, kind of under the radar way of referring to that in their letter. And so some of the Corinthians, even married ones, as we'll find out in a moment, have concluded that it's best, and I think perhaps even more spiritual, to completely abstain from sexual intimacy, even within their marriages. And again, in our culture, we might look at that and go, that's crazy. But in their culture, as we'll find out, it's not so crazy after all. Another thing to remember is that the Corinthians, they're competing with each other over spirituality. And Paul's already addressed 3 or 4 different areas they're competing with each other on. Their social status and wealth, because they think people who have more wealth and higher social status are more spiritual in their society. They think that people who exert dominance or power over people, that's what gets you a leg up in society. And so some of the followers of Jesus believe that's also what gets you a leg up on your spirituality. Winning victories in court, they think, makes you more spiritual, and Paul has already unraveled all of that. Just a couple of weeks ago, we talked about that. And now they're using their marital status as another check mark on the box of spirituality. But in their culture, they believe that being single is the more spiritual way to go in life. And we'll talk about what our culture thinks about that toward the end of our time today as well. And they're actually basing that conclusion on the most current philosophies, medical science, and religious ideas of their day. So again, this is around 52 to 54 AD. And I think there's also some challenges about the way marriage works in Roman society that's fueling this as well. So let's talk about that for just a couple minutes. There's a philosophy called Epicureanism. And Epicureanism teaches that life is all about pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain by listening to your body and your senses. And it would seem like that would drive people towards experiencing sexual intimacy. But Epicureans also recognize that intimacy, as pleasurable as it might be, it can also cause physical harm, they believe, and emotional pain. Do intimate relationships sometimes cause emotional pain? Yeah, they do, because there's so much closeness, but there's room for misunderstanding in the context of relationship. And so for that reason, they're going to advise people, you really should limit your intimacy, because it might be a source of pain just as much as it might be a source of pleasure. Then you have first century Roman physicians, such as Soranus and Rufus, and they're teaching that sexual intimacy is harmful and can even make your body ill. Okay? This is cutting edge first century medical science. So in order to maintain a strong, healthy body, sexual intimacy has to be controlled, or even more ideally, avoided completely. Okay? Stoic philosophers, they're emphasizing really strict control over your bodies. And they think that destructive passions, including the desire for physical intimacy, have to be defeated if you want to become more wise and more free and achieve more status and honor in your culture. And even first century religious philosophers like Philo, he's a Jewish philosopher at the time, he's teaching that the most spiritually dedicated people throughout history have been unmarried and or sexually abstinent people. He's even teaching that Moses was abstinent in his relationships. Where he got that from in the Bible, I do not know, because the Bible doesn't even address that. It clearly talks about Moses being married and remarried in Scripture, but yet he has come to that conclusion. And so even religious philosophy is jumping on board with the culture. Additionally, marriage in first century Rome is definitely not romantic. I need to do some work on the etymology of that, because Rome did not set the standard or the basis for romance in relationships. It's not based around love or affection. Marriage is viewed as a means of enhancing the husband's property and status in society. So he marries a woman that will enhance his amount of property and his status. And The woman's role in marriage is being enabled to legally produce the family's next heir, which every Roman family hopes will be a boy. A male heir is what they're hoping for. 25 to 35-year-old men are commonly marrying 12-year-old girls in Roman society. Marriages are rarely lifelong. Again, they're not for love. And 1 in 5 pregnancies at this point in history is fatal. So the chance of your marriage, if you have several children lasting, is statistically not good, just simply due to how deadly pregnancies are at this time and infant mortality. Unfaithfulness is expected because of the age gaps, and divorce is common among men and women in this culture. So not a lot of things that are trying to sell you on a positive view of marriage in this culture. It's very pessimistic, very misinformed view of physical intimacy in marriage. And so Paul, he wants to speak into that and try to reframe things from God's point of view, because the culture is saying all those things to them, and even medical science at that point in time. And so he's going to reframe sexual intimacy as a good thing, no better than abstaining and no worse than abstaining, as long as it's practiced in the context of a mutual marriage relationship. Paul is about to make also some comments that are going to seem progressive to people in his day. In ancient Rome, marriage is definitely not a mutual partnership, a partnership where both parties are going to reciprocate the same level of understanding, a mutual care, a mutual level of respect for one another. That might be something that our culture is pushing us towards in our relationships today, but in ancient Rome, it is anything but mutual. The husband makes all the calls, the wife has no input and no power at all. And so Paul's going to address that and say, I think, move through this. We talked about this a little bit already about the current philosophies. But Paul's going to say, I think what you need to be aiming for is mutuality in your marriage relationships. And this idea of a mutual care and a mutual concern and a mutual understanding, it's going to bleed over into a lot of different issues that you're dealing with in marriage, and a lot of these social and philosophical kind of misunderstandings, at least from the Bible's point of view, when you try to work this out together as followers of Jesus. And so here's how he walks through that. We're going to look at several things they were dealing with. And again, these might not be things we deal with today, but we're going to try to make some adaptations at the end and figure out how this plays out in our culture. This is how Paul continues. He says, but because of sexual immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise the wife also to her husband. So he's touching on that statement that, again, I believe, and many scholars do, that first sentence, it's good for a man not to touch a woman, was the Corinthians' idea. And he's saying, yes, but. One, sexual immorality is very permissible, very prevalent in this society. And so perhaps marriage has a benefit that way. Marriage allows the body's natural desire for sex to be satisfied in the context of a mutually committed and caring relationship, because the other options are an unfaithful relationship or an abusive relationship. And so Paul's saying, if you have this mutual commitment, and what he's going to go on to show them, a mutual care for one another, that's going to create the best context for physical intimacy. And it's a benefit because many people who were striving to implement all these philosophies and cultural ideas, they were struggling with their body's own natural desire for sexual intimacy. And Paul's saying, marriage, it is useful in that sense. He goes on, he says, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Now, this is not something, again, that's culturally believed in ancient Rome, but it's something that Paul believes is God's perspective on the matter. And likewise, the husband also does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So in ancient Rome, again, the husband has absolute power over his wife's body. The wife has no power over her husband's body. And so when Paul suggests this, what he's doing, he's saying, you need to begin to make joint decisions in your marriage. Yes, it's challenging. Yes, there's a big age gap. Yes, there's some misconceptions about what this is for and how this operates. But when we look at how Jesus would have us pursue relationships, there's a mutual aspect to it. And so regarding decisions about intimacy, you need to work together as a couple to make those decisions. Regarding perhaps even other decisions that you try to make that are related to marriage and even your family, you should involve one another in, instead of just, again, it being so one-sided. And this is revolutionary for them because their culture does not teach them to see marriage in that sense at all. Women are viewed a lot like property in this culture. And there are actually cultures, I've been to some cultures in Africa several years back. And in those cultures, men still buy their wives. And so there are cultures in the world today where women are viewed very much as property, and the husband has all the rights to make the decisions and do whatever he wants with his free time, and the women do all the work because they're paid for. They're just purchases. They're just possessions. And that was Rome's view. But Paul's saying that's not God's view of marriage. There is a certain mutual authority in these situations. And a lot of Romans, I think, were pretty offended by what Paul had to say in this letter, because it's not what society taught at all. He goes on, he says, stop depriving one another by agreement, or except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer, and then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But this I say by way of concession, which is the word, it means permission, not of command. And so Paul actually feels a need to give them permission to have physical intimacy in their marriage because, again, for cultural reasons, I think they were trying to avoid sexual intimacy. Maybe for spiritual reasons. They thought it was more spiritual, again, to avoid sexual intimacy even within a marriage. And Paul is saying, if you're going to cut off that aspect of your relationship, it needs to be very much mutual. It can't just be the man saying, you know what, I feel like the more wise, honorable, status-filled spiritual thing is to just avoid you physically for a while. It can't be like that. Let it be for some sort of positive purpose, like you want to focus on prayer or something, spiritually beneficial, but make sure that it's temporary. It needs to be temporary. Otherwise, power is not really shared. You're not truly giving one another authority in that marriage relationship. And temptation might result, honestly, which I think might be part of the reason why Paul had to address the issue of prostitution just a few verses prior at the end of chapter 6. Again, I think some people are just allowing themselves permission to do whatever their bodies desire, but I think other people are really struggling because they're in this marriage and it feels like they should have access to sexual intimacy in their marriage, but their partner, probably most of the time the men making those decisions, one-sided decisions, for some reason, they were abstaining. Or maybe in certain cases it was wives that were saying, I feel like the more spiritual thing to do or the healthier thing to do is just to avoid this in our marriage. And so some people were going to look elsewhere with uncommitted relationships to fulfill, again, their body's desires in those ways. Paul says, yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am. However, each has his own gift from God, one in this way and another in that. So Paul, he's kind of biased, and he's telling us that. And he actually, several times in this letter, it's interesting because he says, basically, these are my opinions, not necessarily hard and fast teachings from the Lord. So he's not afraid to give his opinions to these Jesus followers in ancient Corinth. And he says, I wish everybody was like me. And we know that Paul, at least at this point in his life, we don't know what his past was like, if he was always unmarried, or if he had been married, or if that marriage ended in a divorce, or his wife left him, or he left his wife. We don't know how all that worked. But at this point in time, he is unmarried. And he says, I kind of wish everybody was unmarried like I am. But I recognize everyone has their own gift. And Jesus actually told his disciples, he was giving some teachings on divorce, and after Jesus finished his teachings, his disciples looked at him and said, if that's the way things need to work, then it's probably better for us just not to ever get married. And even Jesus himself said, well, but everybody has their own gift. And for some of us, maybe we're in a place in life where we're unmarried, and maybe we're happily unmarried. Maybe we've been widowed. Maybe we've gone through a divorce. Maybe we've never been married, but we're just happy in that state. It gives us a little more freedom, a little more focus, a little less distraction in some ways. For others of us, maybe we're in a marriage today. And so we see that as a gift. We're thankful that we have someone to walk through life with. And then there's also the realistic possibility that some of you might be in a marriage and think that being unmarried would be a better gift. And others of you might be unmarried and you're looking at married people going, those people are the people that truly have the gifts. But Paul wants to say there are gifts. Marriage is a gift and singleness is a gift. There are just different good things about those gifts. He's happy for where he's at, but he says there is nothing that's better or worse about either position in life. In fact, there are actually some benefits to both positions in life. He says, but I say to the unmarried and to the widows that it's good for them if they remain even as I am. So again, Paul's saying, I say, like this is his personal opinions. But he says, but if they don't have self-control, let them marry, for it's better to marry than to burn with passion. And here, he's just admitting, like he's talking about distraction. And he recognizes, he talks later in the chapter, and we'll get to that in a few weeks, but he's talking to single people later in this chapter, and he points out the fact that people who are unmarried have less distractions. They can focus their attentions on the Lord. But if you're married, you have your spouse to think about, you might have your kids to think about, your grandkids to think about. But he's also admitting here, there can be situations where not having a marriage partner is more distracting than being unmarried. Maybe because of desires that are constantly warring inside of you, whatever. And so he's just very much owning the fact that there can be benefits and challenges of different positions in marriage. And he's saying, I'm not going to command that people pursue singleness over marriage or marriage over singleness, because there are just different challenges and there are different gifts that are associated with those different phases or places in life. He says, but to the married, I give instructions, not I, but the Lord. So he has something here that he feels like is attached to Jesus' teachings. So he's not just spitballing here. He feels like he's connecting this to some teachings of Christ. That the wife is not to leave her husband. And Jesus talked about that with some teachings with his followers. Again, he was talking about people who pursued frivolous divorces just because they felt like, I could be happier outside of this marriage. And so maybe Paul is entering into that same kind of discussion. Don't just bail on your partner. It says, but if she does leave, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband is not to divorce his wife. He's using different words for leave and divorce, and so different scholars have different ideas on that. Part of that might be the fact that in this culture, perhaps in ancient Corinth, only the husband could legally file for divorce, although we do see examples of women being able to legally file for divorce in Roman culture at different points in time. But maybe that wasn't the case in ancient Corinth, right when Paul was writing. We don't know. Maybe leaving was more of a thing with an open-ended. We don't exactly know all these things. But kind of the baseline of all this is that God's instructing couples in the church not to leave or divorce their spouses for what they perceive, either culturally or religiously, to be a more desirable or honorable unmarried life. Paul is not talking about abuse in the context of this. He's just not. And so you have to go to other scriptures if you want to look at what the Bible has to say about divorce in cases of abuse. And there are some good things in Malachi to visit. There are some good things in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy to visit, where you can go and find teachings that address the concept of divorce in the cases of abuse. But what Paul's talking about here is just people, for whatever reasons, again, culturally or religiously, feeling like it's more spiritual to be unmarried. And also, I think, hard to be married in ancient Rome. Maybe it's hard to be married in our society for different reasons too. But I think some people are looking at this spirituality as a good way out of a difficult marriage. And other people are honestly just saying, well, if it's better and it's healthier, that's what our doctors are saying, and our philosophers are saying, you need to exercise self-control, and some, Jewish teachers are saying that the most spiritual people were unmarried people or abstinent people, then that's probably best. And he's saying, don't leave or divorce a spouse just because you think the single life is more desirable. That's not a good motive to get out of a marriage. Because again, he's just taught that both of these things are gifts, right? One is not better than the other in the Lord's eyes. He's going to say one more final thing this morning. And he says, but to the rest. He's actually addressing people here who have, I'm going to call it a spiritually mismatched marriage. Not to put a negative connotation on it, but it's a situation where one spouse is following Jesus and another is not. And that can result for many reasons. Sometimes people marry that way. Sometimes in the course of a marriage, one spouse might decide to begin trusting in Jesus and following Jesus. And so that's the status. But that's a reality in ancient Corinth too. And so Paul's going to speak to that. He says, to the rest I say, not the Lord, that if any brother has an unbelieving wife and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. So don't divorce your spouse because they're not a follower of Jesus and you think somehow that's putting the brakes on your spirituality. He's saying, I say, not the Lord. So this is Paul's advice, right? God doesn't really speak to this situation in Scripture, and so Paul is just giving his thoughts. He says, and if any woman has an unbelieving husband and he consents to live with her, she must not divorce her husband. So it works both ways. If your spouse is not a follower of Jesus and they're good with living with you as a follower of Jesus, don't just get out of that marriage because things are not equal spiritually. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. This is kind of a mysterious phrase, and I'm going to just give you a shot in the dark at what I think this means, but we ultimately don't know for certain. It says, for otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. And so it seems to some extent that by somebody who's not a follower of Jesus living in the same household with someone who is a follower of Jesus, God is working specifically on behalf of that believer, that follower of him in a household. And because God is working not just kind of this generally like it rains on everybody regardless of the fact of whether you're the most kind and gentle person in the world or you're a murderous dictator, you're still going to get some blessings in life just because of this world you live in. It seems to be focusing on the fact that as a follower of Jesus, God has specific purposes and intentions. And he's kind of like specifically guiding your life and maybe protecting it to a degree. And by somebody being the spouse of someone under God's guidance, more specific guidance, that kind of affects their life as well and kind of affects their kids' lives. Whereas if that person wasn't in their life so closely, maybe they wouldn't receive those same types of benefits from being closely linked to a follower of Jesus. Again, it doesn't mean their life is all roses and they never experience hardship, quite the contrary. It just means that like God's special purposes for that person, again, I think that might be what this means, are kind of protective to a degree over those other family members as well, perhaps. It continues on, yet if the unbelieving one is leaving, let him leave. The brother or the sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us in peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? And so just some more practical situations that they might deal with. The case of somebody whose spouse decides they want to start following Jesus, and that spouse says, I didn't sign up for that. I don't want a religious spouse. I don't want somebody who thinks that like there's a God or somebody who's following this Jesus as their king or somebody who's going to meet with this church gathering. Like that's not what we signed up for when we got married. And Paul says if that's the case and that spouse wants to depart, let them go in peace. You're not called to bondage, to just try to tough it out and stick it out even though that person doesn't want to be with you. So that gives us the idea that whatever marriage is, it's not supposed to be bondage or enslavement. And there's a degree of peace that Paul is appealing to here as well. What's going to result in a peaceful existence? And clearly in some of those mismatched relationships spiritually, there was an element of bondage or just a lack of peace altogether. And Paul says if someone wants to leave, let them go in those circumstances. Because ultimately we're about peaceful relationships. But he also says at the end, how do you know the impact you're going to have on your spouse? If they want to remain in a marriage with you, you may look at that spouse and say, there is no chance. That person will never believe in any kind of God or religion, let alone the Jesus of the Bible. This is not, it's not ever going to happen. You don't know my spouse the way I know them. And Paul's saying, how do you really know? Only God really knows the impact that you might have on an unbelieving spouse in your home. So don't just get out of that because the spiritual relationship is unequal. Paul advises spiritually mismatched couples to remain together as long as the marriage is mutual, there's that word again, because God will personally invest himself. Again, this is kind of my take on it, in each family member in an attempt to draw unbelieving ones into faith in Jesus. And so these are Paul's comments on some areas of marriage that he feels are misunderstood in their culture. And so he finishes out this way, and then I want to apply it to our culture for a couple minutes. He says, only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each, in this way let him walk or her walk, and so I direct in all the churches. So his little closing statement to this part of chapter 7 is, there is no superior relationship status. If you thought you were being super spiritual by divorcing your husband or wife so you could just focus on God, or by abstaining from any kind of physical intimacy because you think spiritually it's a distraction or physically it's unhealthy, just reset that. There is no superior relationship status. Being single is great. It's a gift. Being married is great. It's a gift from God. So don't one-up each other because someone's married and the other person is single. That has nothing to do with our spirituality. So maybe you had questions about that today. Certainly throughout history, certain things have been perceived as more spiritual than the other. This is a couple questions in, but let me just ask you this. How many of you think that in our culture today, being married is viewed as kind of like a higher calling than being single? It's more spiritual, okay? What about singleness? How many of you think that being single might be considered more spiritually high? Yeah, again, a lot of you didn't vote on that. I had 2 or 3 votes in the first and 0 for the second. I think in Utah as a state, marriage is definitely highly prized spiritually. I think that most people in Utah, if you took a survey, most people would say those who are married are more spiritual than those who are unmarried. But in ancient Rome, you would get the complete opposite slant on the survey. Most people would say, of course, being unmarried is much more spiritual. And Paul's saying, no, just reframe that. So don't let yourselves be deceived into thinking that, God prizes one over another. How are current philosophies, medical science, religious ideas, and personal challenges affecting the ways that we view intimacy and marriage? I'm just going to weigh in on this because if we could talk probably for quite a while on this, but I want to hear the wheels turning inside your head a little bit. So religious ideas. This isn't the case so much now, but for me, when I was growing up, especially when I was a teenager, in many Christian circles, there were some really big challenges. There was a thing called purity culture, and it was there were a lot of abstinence pledges, purity rings, things like that. But in the early 90s, many aspects of Christianity in the United States viewed the human body as shameful. They viewed people who lost their virginity as less than, as used, as not worthy of a husband or a wife who had not. There was the idea that a husband deserves sex whenever he wants it, and if he doesn't get it, he's just going to go somewhere else. There was the idea that men cannot control their lust. There was the idea that women make men lust by dressing immodestly, and there were some very strict lines in different realms of Christianity about that. I mean, for many, it was having a skirt that was well below your knee, or sometimes down to your ankle, or having different varying lengths of sleeves, and every denomination had its own definition. But that was a really prominent thing that affected the way a lot of people view intimacy. But those things weren't Bible-based things. Those things were religious ideas and culturally based ideas. Let's talk about medical science. Today, medical science says that sex has a long list of health benefits, a long list. So they would disagree with Rufus and Silanus in first century Rome. But medical science also recognizes sexually transmitted infections and diseases are a reality. And so we've come a little bit in our understanding of that. Current philosophies, there's a whole smattering all across the board from sexual intimacy as a natural way of bonding, regardless of what the context is, to sexual intimacy can undermine values or challenge how you morally treat others if you give in to those desires, and maybe in certain contexts they can. Sexual intimacy is just a way to please the self and others. There's this concept that sex must be consensual in our society, which I think is a positive thing, and it kind of goes toward that mutuality aspect of what Paul is hinting at. People have the right to access information about sexuality. People have the right not to have their sexuality restricted by laws. They're just different philosophies. Some of them, I think, good, some of them neutral, and some of them probably negative. They're floating around in our society as well. But your culture tells you how to view intimacy. And just realize there may be some differences between how God would advise you to view intimacy versus how the culture explains it today as well. Secondly, if we are married, are we making mutual or exclusive decisions about intimacy in other areas of marriage and family life? Again, Paul applies it specifically to the intimate physical relationships in marriage. But if you're going to talk about the most intimate parts of your marriage together, I would think that it would make sense to talk about other less intimate areas of your relationship as well. And so different generations view these things differently, but I think Paul would say in your conversations, bring some degree of mutuality into that today as well. 3, does our culture view singleness or marriage as the easier, healthy, more honorable, and more spiritual path? We talked about that. You can weigh in on that. What are some gifts associated with the single life, and what are some gifts associated with married life? That might be a good little exercise for you, especially if you're struggling with contentment over your current status in life, your marital status. Maybe you're unhappily single or you're unhappily married at the moment. What are some gifts that you experience because of your status right now? And how content are we? And again, this is something that's in flux, right? I mean, I haven't talked about this a lot, but Christine and I have been through some difficult patches in our marriage, as I'm sure many of you have as well. When we were navigating having our kids, we have 4 kids. Our oldest is 11, our youngest is 4. But there was a period of time, specifically when we had a newborn, a 1-year-old, and a 3-year-old, when our life was insane. Christine threw up for 6 months every day, multiple times a day in her pregnancies. She dealt with postpartum depression. Afterwards, for months, I dealt with some workplace environments where I was expected to be there and not necessarily be available for her as much as I should have. And so you want to talk about stress. It was hard, right? So I'm not saying it's easy. But even in those points in time, there's still gifts, right? Last couple things. What are some unacceptable reasons to leave or divorce a spouse? Paul deals with some of that in some circumstances. Are there acceptable ones? And to answer that second question, you're going to have to go other places in Scripture and maybe have other conversations that are beyond that. I think my blanket answer would be, I think there are. I think abuse is definitely one of those acceptable circumstances. But if you want to talk about that more, I'd love to sit down with you if you have questions, on those things, and we can talk. But there's different places in Scripture that deal with this issue. And again, Paul's dealing with something for, I think, more issues of preference in this chapter. But I'd say there are acceptable and unacceptable reasons to look at that. How should we navigate a spiritually mismatched marriage? Why should we stay in one? We talked a little bit about that. When should we allow our partners to leave one? And I would guess somebody here is in one or has been in one. Certainly over the time I've been here as pastor for the last 9 years or so, we've had multiple people who have had spouses that believe very different things than they do spiritually. And I mean, maybe you're even sitting here and one of your spouses is excited about being here and the other one is like, well, we'll just see how this goes. That's fine. Everybody's at a different place, and God's not trying to grab anybody by the arm and, force them into anything to following Him. But how do we deal with that? Those are things that we still wrestle with even today. Let's go ahead and pray this morning.